For 40 days, an entire army did nothing. 40 days. Two armies camped on opposite hills, separated by a valley, and every single morning, the same thing happened. A figure would step out from the Philistine ranks. A figure so large, so heavily armored, so impossibly imposing, that the first time the Israelite soldiers saw him, an entire fighting force, trained men, armed men, men who had marched to this valley prepared for war, looked at him and froze. 9 feet tall or close to it, depending on which ancient measurements you trust. Armor that alone would have weighed more than many men. A spear with a head of solid iron, a sword at his side, a shield carried by another man because it was too heavy for him to manage alongside everything else he wore into battle. And a voice that carried across the valley every single morning, repeating the same challenge, the same mockery, the same impossible demand. Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. 40 days of that voice. 40 mornings of an army hearing the same challenge and having no answer for it. 40 days of a standoff that should have been resolved by a single act of courage from anyone among the thousands of Israelite soldiers gathered in that valley. And it wasn't until a teenager showed up with bread for his brothers. To understand what was happening in that valley, you have to understand the world these armies came from and the specific kind of terror that Goliath represented. This was the era of the early Israelite monarchy. Saul had been anointed king, the first king of Israel, chosen at a time when the nation, having been led for generations by judges and prophets in a looser, more decentralized arrangement, had asked for a king the way the surrounding nations had kings. Saul had shown early promise. He had won battles. He had united tribes that had often operated more like a loose confederation than a single nation. But Saul's kingship had also begun to show cracks, moments of disobedience, moments where the prophet Samuel had delivered warnings that something was shifting, that the throne Saul occupied would not remain in his family. None of this had played out publicly yet, but there was a tension underneath the surface of Saul's reign that the people around him may not have been able to name, but could likely feel. And now Israel faced the Philistines, a people who occupied the coastal regions to the southwest, technologically and militarily sophisticated, equipped with iron weapons and armor, in an era when iron was still a significant military advantage. The Philistines had been a recurring threat throughout this period of Israel's history, and this confrontation in the Valley of Elah was one chapter in a much longer story of conflict between these two peoples. The two armies arrayed themselves on hills on either side of the valley, with the valley itself, the no man's land, the space where any direct confrontation would happen, stretching between them. And then Goliath stepped forward. The text gives us his measurements with a specificity that ancient writers reserved for things they wanted readers to feel the weight of. 6 cubits and a span, by most calculations, somewhere around 9 feet tall, though some textual traditions suggest a slightly smaller but still extraordinary height. His armor is described in detail: a bronze helmet, a coat of mail weighing 5,000 shekels of bronze, somewhere in the range of 125 pounds, just for the armor covering his torso. Bronze greaves on his legs, a bronze javelin slung on his back, a spear with a shaft like a weaver's beam, and an iron head weighing 600 shekels, around 15 pounds, just for the spearhead. This was not an exaggeration for effect, or at least the text does not present it that way. This was a description meant to convey something very specific. This man was, by every conventional measure of military power, unbeatable in single combat. No reasonable person looking at Goliath would conclude that ordinary human strength and skill could overcome him. And he knew it. Every word of his challenge assumed it. 40 days of standing in that valley, issuing the same taunt, had only confirmed it. No one had come. Hello? If this story is already pulling you in, if you can feel the weight of that voice echoing across the valley for 40 straight days, subscribe right now. Because the person who finally answers it is the last person anyone would have expected. While all of this was happening, while two armies sat paralyzed in the valley of Elah, while Goliath's voice echoed across the hills morning after morning, there was a household in Bethlehem going about its ordinary business. Jesse, an Israelite of some standing, had several sons serving in Saul's army, old enough, established enough to be part of the fighting force. And he had a younger son, still tending the family's sheep, still doing the work that fell to the youngest in a large household, the unglamorous, repetitive, often solitary work of watching over animals in the hill country around Bethlehem. His name was David. We have already met David once before this moment. In the broader narrative, he had been anointed by the prophet Samuel some time earlier in a private ceremony that the rest of his family had barely understood the significance of, chosen by God over his older, more impressive brothers in a moment that the text records with deliberate emphasis on how little outward qualification David seemed to have for what he was being chosen for. But on the day this story happens, David was not thinking about anointings or destinies. He was doing what he had likely done many mornings before, tending sheep, and on this particular day, being sent by his father on an errand. Jesse wanted to know how his older sons were doing in the army, camped with Saul's forces near the valley of Elah. He sent David with provisions, bread, roasted grain, cheese, supplies for his brothers and for their commanding officer, with instructions to check on his brother's welfare and bring back word, an errand, a delivery, the kind of task that falls to the youngest member of a household who has not yet earned the kind of responsibilities that come with age and proven capability. David got up early. He left someone else in charge of the sheep. The text notes this detail, a small indication of David's character even in something this minor. He did not simply abandon his responsibility, he made sure it was covered. And he set out for the camp. And when he arrived, he walked into the middle of something he could not have anticipated. The Israelite camp was not a place of confident military preparation. It was a place gripped by fear. David arrived just as the armies were taking their positions for the day. The same positions they had taken for the previous 39 days, the same standoff repeating itself with grinding, demoralizing regularity. He found his brothers. He delivered the provisions his father had sent. He greeted them, and then he heard it. The voice, Goliath's voice, carrying across the valley issuing the same challenge that had been issued every morning for nearly 6 weeks. And David watched, for the first time, seeing what his brothers and the rest of the army had been seeing every single day. The response of the men around him. They ran, or at least they pulled back. The text describes the men of Israel fleeing from him and being dreadfully afraid. Think about what David was witnessing. An army, a real army, with trained soldiers, with the king himself present, with armor and weapons, and the organizational structure of a fighting force, responding to a single man's voice by retreating in fear, day after day, for weeks. And David, who had spent his days and nights in the hill country around Bethlehem, alone with sheep, doing the kind of work that develops a very different relationship with danger than the work of a soldier in formation. David asked a question. He asked what would be done for the man who killed this Philistine and took away the reproach from Israel. He asked, in effect, what is actually happening here? Why is this allowed to continue? His brother's response was not gratitude for the question. Eliab, the oldest, turned on David with anger, accusing him of coming down just to watch the battle, asking him with contempt who he had left the sheep with, telling him essentially to go back to where he belonged. This is worth pausing on, because Eliab's reaction reveals something about the atmosphere in that camp. After 39 days of fear, of paralysis, of an unanswered challenge hanging over the entire army, the arrival of someone asking an obvious question, someone whose presence implicitly highlighted the absurdity of the situation, was not received as a fresh perspective. It was received as an irritation, as something to be shut down. Fear, sustained long enough, becomes its own kind of normal. And anyone who arrives from outside that normal, anyone who looks at the situation with fresh eyes and asks the question everyone inside the situation has stopped being able to ask, becomes, in some strange way, a threat to the equilibrium. Even if the equilibrium is terrible, even if everyone inside it is miserable. David had walked into a camp that had organized itself emotionally around fear. And his question, his simple, obvious question, landed like an accusation, because in some sense, it was one. Not an accusation against any individual, but against the situation itself, against 39 days of nothing. Word of David's question reached Saul, and Saul, the king, the man whose responsibility this was above anyone else's, the man who had presumably spent 39 mornings listening to that same voice and having no response, sent for David. What followed is one of the most quietly remarkable conversations in the entire Hebrew Scriptures. David told Saul, "I will go and fight this Philistine." And Saul's response was the response of someone who had been worn down by weeks of an impossible situation and was looking at a teenager who had no military experience, no armor, no track record, offering to do what an entire army had failed to do. You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. This was not an unreasonable response. By every metric Saul had available, age, experience, training, physical stature, David was not a plausible candidate for single combat against Goliath. Saul's assessment was, in the conventional terms available to him, correct. And David answered with something that reframed the entire conversation. He told Saul about his life, about being a shepherd, about the lions and bears that had come to attack the flock, and what he had done about it. Gone after them, struck them, delivered the sheep from their mouths, and when they rose against him, caught them by their fur and killed them. This was not boasting for its own sake. David was establishing something specific. He had faced mortal danger before. Repeatedly. Alone in the hill country, with no army around him and no audience watching, he had encountered creatures that could kill him and had not run. He had developed through this unglamorous, unwitnessed, repeated experience, something that the soldiers in Saul's camp, for all their formal training, apparently had not developed. A tested relationship with fear. A track record, even if no one else had seen it, of facing something larger and more dangerous than himself and not backing down. And then David said the words that reframe everything. The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. David was not claiming confidence in his own ability to defeat a 9-foot-tall armored warrior. He was claiming something else entirely. Confidence in the same God who had been present in the hill country, in the unwitnessed encounters with lions and bears, in the long days and nights of a shepherd's solitary work. The same God who had shown up there would show up here. The arena had changed. The presence had not. Saul let him go. Comment below right now. Has there ever been a moment when something you developed in private, in obscurity, with no one watching, turned out to be exactly what an impossible public moment required? Tell us, because David's whole life had been preparing him for this morning, without anyone, including David, fully realizing it. Saul tried to give David armor, his own armor, a bronze helmet, a coat of mail, a sword. The king's own equipment, offered to the boy who was about to walk into the valley. It is, in its own way, a generous gesture. Saul, whatever his own fear and paralysis, was trying to give David every advantage available. David put it on, and then he took it off. I cannot go with these, for I am not used to them. This moment deserves more attention than it usually gets. Because David was not refusing armor out of some kind of performative humility, or out of a desire to make the eventual victory look more miraculous by stripping away every advantage. He was making a practical assessment about himself. Saul's armor did not fit David's life. David had never trained in armor. He had never developed the specific movements, the specific balance, the specific instincts that come from years of wearing heavy military equipment. Putting on Saul's armor would not have made David more capable. It would have made him less capable. Weighed down by equipment he did not know how to use, moving in ways his body had never practiced, fighting with tools that were not the tools his hands and his years of experience had shaped him for. David went into the valley with what he knew: a staff, a shepherd's bag, 5 smooth stones selected from a stream, and a sling. The sling was not a child's toy in this context. In the hands of someone who had spent years using it to drive off predators and protect a flock. Someone who had, in fact, just described killing lions and bears. A sling was a weapon that David had genuine mastery over. Not borrowed mastery, not the king's mastery, draped over someone it did not fit. His own mastery, developed in obscurity, honed in situations no one had been watching. This is one of the most practically wise moments in the entire story, and it is easy to read past it in the rush toward the dramatic confrontation. David did not go into the valley pretending to be something he was not. He did not borrow an identity, the king's armor, the king's weapons, the trappings of conventional military readiness that did not belong to him and that he had not earned the use of. He went in as himself, with what he actually knew how to do. And then David walked down into the valley. Picture this. On one side, the Philistine ranks, and at their front, Goliath, in full armor, with his armor-bearer beside him, the routine of 40 mornings about to be repeated. On the other side, the Israelite army, soldiers who had spent nearly 6 weeks in fear, watching this same scene unfold, having long since stopped expecting anything different. And walking down into the space between them, a teenager, no armor, a staff in his hand, a shepherd's bag at his side. Goliath saw him coming, and the text tells us what he felt: disdain. He looked at David, saw a boy, ruddy and handsome, by the description given, clearly not a soldier, clearly not equipped for what was about to happen, and he was offended, insulted even. This was the response Israel was sending? After 39 days? Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And then Goliath cursed David by his gods and issued his own challenge. Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. This is the moment where the disparity between these two figures reaches its sharpest point. Everything about this scene, the size difference, the armor, the weapons, the track record, the 40 days of demonstrated dominance, everything said this was not a contest. This was a formality, a brief, almost embarrassing prelude to an outcome that was not in question. And David spoke. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This was not bravado in the conventional sense. David was not pretending the disparity in arms and size did not exist. He named it directly. Sword, spear, javelin, all the things Goliath carried that David did not have. And then he named what he was bringing instead, not a weapon at all, but a name. The name of the Lord of hosts, the God whose armies, and the word armies here is significant, because it includes the very Israelite forces standing paralyzed on the hillside, the armies whose god Goliath had been mocking for 40 days without consequence. David was not just fighting for himself. He was making a statement about who this confrontation was actually between. Not David versus Goliath, the God of Israel versus the one who had defied him. And then David ran toward Goliath. This is the moment the whole story has been building toward, and it happens in the text with breathtaking speed. David ran toward the Philistine line. He took a stone from his bag, put it in his sling, and slung it. And it struck Goliath in the forehead, the one part of his body, by some readings, that may have been less protected by his heavy armor. And the stone sank into his forehead, and Goliath fell on his face to the ground. That's it. That's the moment. A few sentences. No prolonged combat, no exchange of blows, no drawn-out struggle between two warriors testing each other's skill. David ran forward, He used the weapon he had spent years mastering, and the giant who had stood unchallenged for 40 mornings fell face down in an instant. Then David ran to Goliath, took the Philistine's own sword, and used it to finish what the stone had started and cut off his head. The Philistine army, watching their champion fall, the man whose presence had defined the entire standoff, whose voice had echoed across that valley for weeks, broke and ran. And the army of Israel, the same men who had been frozen in fear moments before, rose up with a shout and pursued them. 40 days of paralysis, resolved in less time than it takes to read the account of how it happened. There is something about the speed of this resolution that matters. The build-up, the 40 days, the size of Goliath, the weight of his armor, the specificity of his weapons, the fear that had gripped an entire army, all of that build-up creates an expectation of a correspondingly difficult resolution. A long battle, a near defeat followed by a turning point. Something proportional, in narrative terms, to everything that came before, and instead, a stone, a sling, and an instant. This disproportion is not an accident of storytelling. It is, in many ways, the entire point. The size of the obstacle and the size of the resolution did not need to match, because the resolution was never actually about David's strength versus Goliath's strength. It was about something else entirely, the same something else David had named before he ever picked up the sling. The Lord of Hosts, the God whose armies had been mocked for 40 days and who in a single moment ended the mockery completely. It is worth returning before we close to those 40 days, because they are not incidental to this story. They are, in some ways, the most important part of it. 40 days of an entire army, trained, armed, present, capable by every conventional measure, doing nothing. 40 days of a challenge going unanswered. 40 days of fear becoming, as we discussed earlier, its own kind of normal, its own equilibrium, however miserable. What changed on day 40 was not that someone suddenly became strong enough to defeat Goliath, who had not been strong enough before. Saul was still Saul. The soldiers were still the soldiers. Nothing about the army's conventional capability had changed in those 40 days. What arrived on day 40 was someone whose relationship to the situation was different. Someone who had not spent those 40 days inside the camp, absorbing its fear, becoming acclimated to its paralysis. Someone who arrived from outside, from the hill country, from the work of tending sheep, from a context where the question, what is actually happening here, and why is it being allowed to continue, had not yet been silenced by weeks of repetition. David's outsider status was not a disadvantage in this story. It was, in a real sense, the thing that made everything else possible. He could see the situation clearly because he had not been inside it long enough to stop seeing it clearly. He could ask the obvious question because no one had yet trained him not to ask it. This is worth sitting with, because most of us, at some point, find ourselves either as the camp, habituated to a fear or a paralysis or a situation that has gone on so long, it has become the water we swim in, invisible to us precisely because we are so thoroughly inside it. Or as David, arriving at a situation from outside, seeing clearly what everyone inside has stopped being able to see, and facing the choice of whether to speak up or to be absorbed into the same equilibrium everyone else has accepted. The 40 days were not wasted time before the real story began. The 40 days were the story revealing itself, showing, with increasing clarity, exactly what kind of intervention was actually needed. Not more soldiers, not better armor, not a different king. Something else. Someone whose confidence rested somewhere other than in conventional military readiness. David walked back from that valley carrying Goliath's head, and the army of Israel, the same army that had spent 40 days in fear, followed the fleeing Philistines with a shout, reclaiming ground and plunder that the standoff had kept them from for weeks. And David went back, eventually, to whatever came next in his life, which, as anyone familiar with the larger story knows, was an extraordinary and often extraordinarily difficult journey. Years as a fugitive, years of waiting for promises made to him to be fulfilled, years before he would actually become king, with countless valleys still ahead of him, many of them far longer and far harder than this one. But this valley, this one morning, this one moment, established something, not just for David, but as a pattern, a testimony, a story that would be told and retold for the rest of Israel's history and far beyond it. The pattern is this: the things that look unbeatable by every conventional measure are not necessarily unbeatable. The voice that has echoed across the valley for 40 days, that has frozen an entire army, that seems to have established itself as the permanent and unquestionable reality of the situation. That voice can be answered, not necessarily by someone stronger, not necessarily by someone better equipped, sometimes by someone who has spent time in obscurity, in unwitnessed places, developing a quiet confidence in something larger than the conventional measures of the situation, and who arrives almost by accident at exactly the moment the answer is needed. What is the Goliath in your life? What is the voice that has been echoing for 40 days, or 40 months, or 40 years, that everyone around you has stopped expecting to be answered? What situation has become so normalized in its fear, its paralysis, its sense of permanent impossibility, that the question, "Why is this still happening?" feels almost rude to ask? And what are the stones in your bag? What has been developed in the unwitnessed places of your life? The hill country, the long days with the sheep, the lions and bears no one saw you face. That might be exactly, precisely, unexpectedly what this moment requires. David did not need Saul's armor. He needed what he already had. And the same God who had been present in the unwitnessed places was present in the valley too. The arena changes. The presence does not. If this story is stirring something in you today, if you recognize your own valley, your own 40 days, your own Goliath, please share this video with someone who needs to hear that the unbeatable is not always unbeatable. Leave a comment below. Tell us about your Goliath, the thing that has stood unanswered in your life for far too long. Tell us about your stones, what you've developed in private that might be exactly what's needed. Comment 5 stones. If you're ready to walk into your valley today, subscribe, because every story in this series is about ordinary people who walked into impossible situations, carrying nothing but what they already had and what happened next. The valley is waiting, and so are the stones in your bag.